Well, welcome to Mike and Pen. Today we are joined by Karitas Palsdottir, and she is in Iceland. And I met Karitas in the Families in Global Transition Conference. And they had a marvelous room where people could hang out virtually. And it was a pleasure to meet Karitas there. Uh, can you tell us what brought you to Families in Global Transition?
Yes, it was wonderful to meet you there and make the connection. The reason why I went to that conference was both professional and personal. I have myself lived abroad. I am Icelandic, but I've lived in several places throughout the years, in Denmark, in the US, in Spain and Japan, and currently in England, where I do a PhD in creative writing. And the professional interest is related to my PhD thesis, which is on the topic of re-entry, when people return back home after having lived for a period of time abroad. They often encounter a reverse culture shock or other psychological challenges, and that's what I'm looking at from a creative fiction perspective in my thesis.
Oh, and so your thesis is a work of fiction. Is this right?
It is, yes.
Yeah.
As a PhD student in creative writing, it has both a creative and a critical component. So I'm working on a short story collection written in English about re-entry experiences, fictional experiences. And then in the critical aspect, I am doing a literary analysis of fictional work that already exists and how re-entry experiences are portrayed there.
Oh, this will be a wonderful resource for TCKs all around the world. Third culture kids are constantly re-entering something. Sometimes they are not re-entering their passport country, but they're still coming back to something that they knew. Oh, and tell us one or two titles that already exist that you are analyzing.
I do enjoy Americana by Chimamanda Adichie Ngozi. She wrote the book Americana, and it is more about the immigration experience living in the US, but there is a last section of the book that is about the re-entry part, which is very exciting and interesting. That's to mention one. And then another one that I'm looking at is an Icelandic novel that has not been translated yet. So I get to translate the quotes that I use myself. And that one is called Að heiman, Away from Home, and is about a woman who studies abroad for just a semester or a year in Germany and then comes back to Iceland. So I'm looking at experiences of people that have been in different countries. So it's not just based in Iceland only or coming back to Iceland. It's just coming back to a home country in general.
Yeah, one thing about TCKs is that we are all different and have completely different experiences, but the humanity in us finds a connection. And at the conference, that was the beautiful thing. We were all connected by the reaction we had to the experiences of leaving, of coming home, of being different but the same. Yeah, all these things.
Yes, it's a shared experience on the emotional level in a way.
Yes, it's very special. I was really blown away. This was my first time at the conference. Had you been to the conference before?
This was my second time.
Second time, yeah.
I returned because it was a nice atmosphere, a lot to learn and reflect on.
Mm-hmm. And what are the insights that you're gaining from what are two insights from analyzing these books?
Well, it's a bit early on, so I don't know.
Oh, how early is it? How long have you been studying?
It's my second year now, but I haven't presented any findings yet. But it is very interesting to explore this liminality of being in between, experiencing that idea of being both and neither or. That in-betweenness is an emerging theme in both my creative and my critical thesis. And I'm really excited to look into it further and at some point share it with the world, because I think there's a lot to learn from how fiction addresses these experiences and these difficult emotions.
Both and is a language we use around MicAndPen a lot. My website is based on both and. And there has to be some either or. We need some differentiation, but there's a lot more and than there is or. Now your own creative work, what is the plot about this? And the characters, can you describe your work?
Yes, so the short story collection I'm working on for my creative part of the thesis has individual stories, so they're not interlinked, in an attempt to show that it's an universal experience and it goes across cultures and nationality. So in each story, there are new countries or nationalities, new home and host culture that the protagonist is moving between. So that's a fun challenge. And each story addresses a different emotion, whether it be sorrow or anxiety, or different role in society. So
this is you take the emotion as the framework, right?
Yes. Thesis is interdisciplinary in regard to some of the sources that I use for inspiration are psychological research or sociology, migration. There's a lot of different fields that have researched the topic of reentry. But by bringing these different perspectives together in fiction, I'm finding that I'm able to get something new across, or at least hopefully share it with a new audience.
The way that fiction acts in the brain. This is what my presentation was for the conference was. We feel like we're actually doing it and our brain lights up in the way we do it. So reading about it will prepare us for it. So you're really writing a manual for reentry, but in a way that will, it's not just facts and a list of things to do, but it's people going through this experience and leading us emotionally. Oh, that's very beautiful.
Yeah, hopefully it will help some people, help them prepare, as you say, emotionally for what's to come, returning.
Yes, and you have experienced these emotions. Can you talk about your transitions between all these cultures?
Yes, but I don't know where to start because, as I mentioned, the countries are numerous now that I've returned from, always back to Iceland. and being at different ages at these times, and sometimes returning with family, sometimes on my own, having experienced it before versus doing it for the first time, all affects the experience. So I would say I've had a very broad experience of reentry, and that's part of why I find this topic so fascinating. It's hard to master reentry because the situation around you can really affect how the transition is, and also language and cultural differences. It can take more time to readapt once you've been further away, perhaps, or there's all these different things.
Right. As a child, what was the youngest age that you re-entered Iceland?
I lived in Denmark the first 5 years of my life. So I was a TCK. And so I was 5 years old when I moved to Iceland and lived there for the first time. But I still do identify as being Icelandic as the core, because that's where I went to visit and where I have most of my roots and my family. So I don't remember much moving to Iceland at that time. And because I had lived in Denmark before then, I don't really see that as a re-entry either. So my first experience of re-entry is when I'm 18 and I returned to Iceland after having lived in the US for 2 years and went to high school there. And yeah, that was a big transition for me and my whole family. It felt very different coming back.
Yes. What was the main emotion?
There was a lot of sorrow. There is this nice quote by Dr. Seuss that my family used at that time. It's "Don't cry because it's over, smile because it happened." And it did help to some extent, but there was a lot of sorrow for me at least, to leave my close friends behind and come back to a home that didn't feel like my home anymore, and having to make new connections and new friends in Iceland.
The grief.
Yes.
That's something TCKs have. This grief tower that I learned about, Lauren Wells and her grief tower book. Yeah. And sometimes it's big griefs and sometimes it's little griefs, and both and.
Yes, the tangible ones and the intangible. There's a lot of hidden grief as well.
Yeah. Are you continuing to discover griefs and joys from that American experience?
Yes. Well, researching this as part of my PhD, I'm understanding better the nuances of it and everything that's underneath the iceberg, I guess, if you picture it that way. So there's grief over so many different things, like a different version of what the future could have looked like. There's a grief of leaving friends behind. There's a grief of so many things that aren't apparent at first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a lifelong discovery.
Mm-hmm.
And have you heard of geography of the soul?
I have not.
It's how our bodies and souls get rooted in the land. it has to do with the magnetic forces, going from South Pole to North Pole, South Hemisphere, North Hemisphere, mountains, lakes, prairie, forest, jungle. All these things speak to us on a level that it's all non-verbal. But we can get attached to a certain area of countryside. Do you? Does that resonate with you?
To some extent, in Iceland, and I guess also when I was in Denmark, I'm always close to the sea. So seeing the ocean is something I find comforting. So it was strange to be in Tokyo because even though I was geographically close to the sea, it's a harbor city, the skyscrapers are so tall, and I was too far away to see it every day like I do when I live in Iceland. So also when I lived in Minnesota, which is in the middle of the US, it felt strange not to see the ocean for months on end, but it did feel a bit like home going up to Lake Superior, which is such a big lake that it feels like the ocean. So
it has tides too.
Yeah.
Yeah, the ocean is such a huge body of matter, of substance, and I am attached to the ocean too, but you feel the tides. You don't have to be seeing the tide to feel it on your body. It pulls and it gives you an experience. And then when you don't have that, that is part of the nonverbal grief, the hidden grief. People who have grown up in the desert, they miss the desert. The smells that are associated with that. Yeah. Thank you for telling us about your experience. Now, how old were you in Tokyo?
I was there as part of my bachelor degree, so I was 21.
And so that was, you didn't have much time in Iceland before you left again. You said you came in when you were 18.
Yes, I was in Iceland for 3 years before going for 1 year in Japan.
1 year in Japan. And what was when you came home from Japan, what was the emotion associated with that re-entry?
There was some loss of independence and freedom coming back to live with my family after having lived alone in a foreign country. And yeah, there were also just cultural differences. The Japanese are very polite and yeah, value time in a different way. You show politeness by giving people off your time and listen to them or explain things very carefully. And I really missed the food and my friends and yeah, different things. So there was some loss as well, but different also because I felt that I grew a lot in Japan and I became independent woman. Yeah, I really became an adult.
Yes, that's a very brave way to become an adult, far away from your family. Did they visit at all?
It did. It was lovely and made it so much easier to share the experience. So they knew firsthand some of the things that I had seen and done and tasted and so on.
Yes. It's a lovely thing. And then when you came back, they were able to understand a little bit of what you were missing.
Yes, a little bit. But I guess you then also just go back into the habit of daily life and forget that perhaps I was there a whole year and they were only there a few weeks, and
Yes.
how different that impact is. So yes, pros and cons.
Yes. So you had to fight for your freedom a second time. Did you feel that? When coming back into the family, you had established yourself in Japan, and then you bring that back with you, and you have to fight for it to still exist.
Yeah, it's like two realities that clash a bit, and trying to find the rhythm again in family life after having been alone. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And that's also something that is common in the families in global transition. I hear some couples get separated, or the children go away to boarding school and then they come back into the family unit, and everybody has to push and shove for their space and get used to the fact that this person is not the person who left. They come back with some new treasure that is precious to them. They need to have that. That's an interesting dynamic that you're addressing in your short stories, right?
Yes. All of this I address in one way or another in my short stories.
Oh, and would you mind saying a few words about your move to Spain?
What can I say about my move to Spain? That was only one semester, and I took Spanish classes at the university there, and I did flamenco dancing, and that was lovely. It was a lot shorter than some of my other sojourns, and I could feel it that I was more of a visitor than a resident, like I felt in the other countries. But at the same time, it felt a bit of an awkward time to return, because I was finally becoming confident in speaking Spanish, and I was disappointed to have to go back, and felt like I would lose the ability down quite quickly again, since I didn't have longer to make it stick better, sink in.
Did you learn Japanese?
I did, yes. In Japan, I was studying Japanese at the University of Waseda in Tokyo. So I went to classes and was learning Japanese in my everyday as well. So.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Immersion.
Yes.
Yeah. So you went to Spain to study.
Yes, I went to Spain to follow my mom on a sabbatical, and I was studying Spanish there at the university. Only one course though. It wasn't a full program, because I was working on my PhD application, and then my first book was about to come out, so I was in the editing process with my editor at that point too.
Oh, a wonderful way to introduce. Tell me about your first book, and then we'll talk about your book that's just being released this next month.
Yes, thank you.
So what led you to write the first book?
Yes, so my first book is called Árstíðir in Icelandic, which means seasons, and it has the second title of Sögur á einföldu máli, which means stories in easy language. And I wrote these stories for Icelandic language learners because I felt there was a need for more stories for adults who decide to learn Icelandic. Yes, and how did that all come to be? I did write the stories as part of my master's thesis in creative writing at the University of Iceland. But the idea had been with me for quite some time, since I've been in Japan, and and I was influenced by the language learning that I've done and all the good resources there are in other languages. Icelandic is a micro language in some sense because there's only about 360,000 people who live in Iceland. But there are about 100 universities around the world that do teach Icelandic, either Old Icelandic or Modern Icelandic. And because of the smallness of the language, maybe we're a bit behind in making resources for people studying Icelandic, but I wanted to contribute to the flora, to literature that language students could use to advance in their studies and kind of bridge the gap between very basic informational texts, the phrases you learn in textbooks, over to reading fiction and reading for pleasure. So my stories are relatively short, they're flash fictions. So in the first book, I counted the length. They're from 60 words to 600. So all relatively short and in easy language, so they should be accessible. And I did other things for accessibility. I found out their difficulty level. I figured out a scale to then divide them into 5 difficulty levels within the European framework for languages, because I found that the language level was on A2 to B1, which is the second and third level out of 6 according to the European framework. But that's a rather big gap still. So I made those 5 level distinctions within my book and labeled them according to difficulty level. Even though I did not organize the stories in the book that way, I wanted to have it accessible so readers could see how difficult the stories were, but I did not want it to be defined by that. So the stories are thematically arranged into the seasons. So it starts with summer and then comes fall, winter and spring. In the attempt, or my hope is that readers then pick up the book and get interested in a title and read the story regardless of whether it's too easy or too difficult, because that's an abstract idea really, even though it can be helpful in the classroom setting especially.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a beautiful way of making both happen.
Yes.
It's the and again, right? We want you to feel comfortable at the reading level, but we want you to engage with the material. Oh, it's beautiful.
Thank you.
And it's written from an Icelandic perspective, and you're bringing forward Icelandic cultural practices and themes, so that they're not only learning the semantics of the language, but it's everything behind which makes a language a living thing.
Oh, that's a beautiful way to put it. Yes, my hope for my stories, both in this first book and the second book, is that they not only improve people's literacy in Icelandic, so on the grammar and vocabulary level, but also on the cultural level. So as you say, the stories have cultural elements in them. They introduce Iceland, what everyday life is like, and they also introduce some more specific cultural celebrations, especially in my second book, which focuses on the calendar days, like holidays, and how we celebrate them in special ways in Iceland. But again, when learning a language, the things that are close to you and everyday normal things or universal things are easier to understand. So when the stories speak about very specific Icelandic things, cultural things, or people or history, the stories are usually on a more advanced difficulty level. And there's also an appendix with additional information. So because I acknowledge that the readers might not have the cultural background and that they would not get the allusions that the text makes without getting a bit of a subtext in the appendix.
When is the new book coming out? What is the date for release?
There is not a date out yet, unfortunately, but it's coming.
What stage are you at?
It's in the printing presses, yeah. It's being printed abroad, and hopefully it will arrive in Iceland in the next couple of weeks. I'm so excited.
And so you will put it out for sale once you have it printed and received in your
Yes.
your house. You'll have boxes of books.
Yes, the book is also it's published by the publishing press Una Útgáfuhús, so they'll be the ones to store all the boxes. So I'll just be comfortable with a few copies myself. I do not have an author website. I have a Facebook account and an Instagram account for the books, but the best way to buy the book is either through the publishers directly or through Icelandic bookstores, because most of them will have them in stock.
Right. And I'm sure that you will want to get them into the universities, the 100 universities around the world that are teaching Icelandic.
Yes, that would be great. I have heard that stories from the first book, Árstíðir, have been used abroad in some places, in Italy, for example, in Scotland. And then there's a big Icelandic community in Canada and the US. Yes. There's Icelandic heritage societies. So I know some people learning Icelandic in North America have also enjoyed reading the stories. And it's such an honor to hear from readers all over the world.
Yeah, and I'm sure they're eagerly awaiting your second book. And do you have plans for more books in this direction?
Yeah, easy language, a new genre, or at least in Iceland, it's new. Yes, I do enjoy this very much. And even though my PhD project is different, it's not an easy language. I would like to return to write easy language stories at some point.
And when you are finished with your creative writing PhD, then are you going to be a prolific author? What is your career path?
I'd love to stay in academia and teach creative writing, continue to research and write myself as well. Yeah, so I do enjoy all of these different aspects of academia.
So I thank you very much for joining us at MicAndPen. Is there anything that you would like to tell us that we haven't talked about?
No, this has been wonderful. Thank you for having me.
It's been a pleasure to speak with you. I'm very glad that we were connected, and I look forward to further connections. As you publish more books, we'll have more interviews.
So am I. Thank you so much.